And good morning. How's everybody doing? Happy Thanksgiving. Hi, April. Happy Thanksgiving. Hi, Yanan. Hope you have the kids settled at school this morning. It's good to see everybody. Anybody have plans for this week? Where are you going for Thanksgiving? Going to see family, friends? Who's cooking? Good morning, John. Good to see you as well. Up and at 'em on a Monday morning. I am so glad everybody could make it this morning. Yeah, so we're talking about chapter 13, the self, today. So it's good to see you. Good to see you. So tell me something cool. What's up for Thanksgiving weekend? Congratulations on, by the way, congratulations on finishing exam 3. We are now 3/4 of the way through this class. I don't know about you, but I am so excited. As soon as we get to Thanksgiving, I always feel like the semester is on the end. You know what I mean? We are on the downslide, just about to finish up. Okay, let's see. We got Anan, and we got April, we got Yanan, and we got John. So y'all ready to go ahead and get started this week? So we're talking a little bit about personality, the relatively stable set of thoughts, emotional responses, and behaviors that characterize a person. It's the same quality that causes two people to respond differently to the same stimulus. Okay, we're going to talk about why personality is important, and then we're going to talk to uh, we're going to define the self, and we're going to talk about two broad approaches to personality. How does the self develop, and can we find reliable ways to measure aspects of the self today? So let's go ahead and get started. So the self is a relatively permanent set of beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors that causes you to respond differently to the same stimuli as another person. So, April, somebody comes through and tells a joke. You laugh and I don't. Personality explains why you found that joke funny and why I didn't find that joke funny. You and I both have our boss talk to us. I'm very rude to the boss. You're very polite to the boss. Personality is what explains how we respond differently to the boss. It's why we behave certain ways. It's why we feel certain ways. It's why we think certain ways. All right, now I want to start off by telling you that the self, if you will, doesn't really exist. Now, I'm not trying to say this to be metaphysical. Ooh, like the Dalai Lama telling you there is no self. You become one with the universe. What I'm trying to say is that the self is actually an abstraction. It's a schema. It's a belief. It's something that you create in your mind based upon your early experiences in life. Yourself exists, your belief in yourself exists just as much as your belief in fire trucks or your knowledge of psychology. It's nothing but a schema. So, if you remember from chapter 7, we talked about schemas. Uh, you can think of the self as being a schema. We'll call it the self schema. And it's a set of interrelated facts about you. It includes the facts about you, your personal identity. It includes facts about the groups you belong to. Remember, we talked about social identity last week, the groups that you belong to. It includes your preferences, it includes your history, if you will. The events that happened to you, the concerts that you've been to, the arguments that you've had, the people that you've met, the places that you've been. All of this represents the self schema. And if you look right underneath me, here's the idea, here's a diagram of a self schema. So yourself, you're a daughter, a sister, a student. These are your groups. Then you might have personality traits. You're ambitious, you're stylish, you're shy. Then you might have physical characteristics. You're tall, you're brunette, you're short, you're blonde, you have gray hair. And then it may be the kinds of things you find interesting. I like movies. I like soccer. I personally like baseball. All of these represent, if you will, the set of beliefs that make up the schema we call the self. So, just like every other schema that you have a schema of the self, your self schema. Now, the crazy thing is, we don't access every part of the self every moment of the day. There are aspects of myself that I hardly ever think of. And on the other hand, there are aspects of myself that I think of all the time that are chronically accessed for me. So every day I wake up and think about being a college professor. This is a chronically accessed part of myself. Every day I wake up and think about being a family man or thinking about being a husband. I think about baseball. All of these represent chronically accessed aspects of the self. And so you can differentiate between your entire self schema and the self schema that you chronically access. We'll call this your working self concept. These are the aspects of yourself that you are currently thinking about or that you chronically think about. This is the self that's in your short term memory. What are you thinking about right now? April, what aspect of yourself are you thinking about right now? Yanan, what aspect of yourself are you currently thinking about right now? John Ramos, what aspect of yourself are you thinking about right now? We'll call this your working self concept. Your working self concept, all right? Now, and you can think of your self esteem as one aspect of your chronically accessible self. How good do you feel about yourself? We all have good qualities, we all have bad qualities, we all have positive qualities and negative qualities. But what qualities do you chronically think about, and are they positive or negative? You can think of your self esteem as a global evaluation of yourself that is chronically accessible. How many of you have a friend that's like Eeyore and thinks bad about themselves? They're always depressed and neurotic, thinking about the bad aspects of themselves. Do any of you have a friend like that? How many of you have a friend that is incredibly confident and always thinking about the positive aspects of themselves? These people may differ in self esteem, which is your global evaluation of yourself. If you would, please take the Rosenberg self esteem scale. It's a 10-question self evaluation that's been used for probably about 60 years to measure people's global evaluation of themselves. And you'll look it over here and you'll see the 10 questions that are asked about people, that people are asked to decide about themselves. On the whole, I am satisfied with myself. At times, I think I'm no good at all. I feel that I have a number of good qualities. I am able to do things well as most other people. I feel that I do not have much to be proud of. I certainly feel useless at times. I feel that I'm a person of worth, at least on equal plane with others. Or I wish I could have more respect for myself. All in all, I'm inclined to think I'm a failure, or I take a positive attitude towards myself. If you think about it, these are all just general evaluations of whether or not you are a good person or a negative or a bad person. And Rosenberg suggests that you can use these 10 questions to evaluate a person's sense of self esteem. So, yourself is really nothing more than a schema, a set of beliefs that you have about yourself. Your working self concept are the aspects of the self that you chronically access, and those aspects of yourself typically include a global evaluation of yourself, your self esteem, if you will. So, if we think about it, that's what the self is. That's all you are. It's just a set of beliefs that you have about yourself. Now, one of the things that people do is they're constantly comparing themselves to others. Every day you wake up and you see other people and you think about them and you think about them relative to yourself, right? And so, in a sense, some people use the self. Some people's sense of self-esteem bounces up and down on a day-to-day basis based upon who they are comparing themselves to. This fellow named Mark Leary from Wake Forest University has this thing called the sociometer hypothesis, and he says your self-esteem is actually an unconscious evaluation of how well you are fitting in with your peer group. If you have low self-esteem, he argues it is a sign to you that you do not fit in well with the groups that you are a part of and you need to change your behavior. On the other hand, he argues if you have high self esteem, this serves as an indicator, a marker that you are doing well within the groups that you are a part of. Developmental psychologists think that high self esteem may act as a buffer against frustration and failure. We all have failures. We are all frustrated because we're not successful in situations. Some people believe that this positive evaluation of ourselves actually serves as a protective factor against the vagaries of the world, the failures and the frustrations that we feel. Now, one of the things I will tell you is that most people with positive self esteem, most people who are not depressed, have illusions about the self. All of you are a little bit deluded about how good you are if you are not depressed. So we like to think of beliefs about the self as being slightly diluted in the positive direction. And people use strategies to maintain this positive sense of self. All right. So, I don't know if you know this, but most people suffer from what's known as the better than average effect. April, what kind of a driver are you? You'd probably say, I'm better than average. Yanan, I might ask you, how smart are you? And Yanan, you'd say, better than average. Uh, John, I might ask you, how attractive are you compared to other males? And you would probably say, I'm better than average. It turns out that one of the weird things that you'll see is that most people, when asked to evaluate themselves as better than average. Now, statistically speaking, I will tell you that 50% of us are below average in any given trait, but almost 90% of us are going to say we're better than average. So, in a sense, we are all deluded about how good looking, how smart, how intelligent, how good a cook, how good a driver we are. In fact, one of the crazy things you'll find is that people who are depressed tend to have a more self-accurate view than those people who are not depressed. So actually, we say it's healthy to be a little bit deluded about your abilities, right? Now, the other thing is most people, when you ask them about the successes that they are a part of, so let's say you are in a group that makes an A on a group project, most of you are going to overestimate the impact that you had on that group project, on that team effort, if that effort is successful. On the other hand, if you are part of a group and that group experiences failure, most of us tend to underestimate the amount of impact we had on that event. We call that the self serving bias. If my group is good, I was the reason why. If my group was bad, I didn't have anything to do about that. That's called the self serving bias. And one of the things that you're going to find is that, as a general rule, people prefer to compare themselves to others who are less good on whatever the comparison dimension is. So when we talk about people's attractiveness, we always like to compare ourselves to people that we look better than. When we compare our marriage, we like to compare our marriage to people who don't have marriages as good as us. When we are comparing our intelligence, we like to compare ourselves to people whose intelligence isn't as good as ours. Human beings love to engage in downward comparison and experience negative affect, that is, negative feelings, when they're forced to engage in upward comparing themselves against people who are better. And one of the interesting gender differences that you'll notice about self esteem is right here below me. You're going to notice actually two interesting phenomenons about people's self evaluation. Your evaluation is highest in early and middle childhood, and then your self esteem always experiences a drop. Almost all of us during our teen years will experience a drop in our level of self esteem. How many of you felt bad about yourself in high school or felt like you weren't good looking enough or smart enough or popular enough? Everybody's self esteem takes a hit early in their teenage years, and then your self esteem peaks again in your late 50s and early 60s when we begin to feel confident. And then our self esteem takes another dip as we become less, uh, as we lose our capacities in older adulthood. But more importantly, you'll see a gender difference. Men always tend to have more self esteem than do women. And I've always wondered, why is it that men feel more confident about their abilities than do women? Does anybody out there have a theory why men have higher self esteem in general than women? April, Yanan, John, what do you think? Do you have any ideas? I'd be curious to hear your theory. All right. So the weird thing is, not only do we all have this set of beliefs that are chronically accessible, called a working self concept, a lot of people, most people, spend a great deal of effort trying to maintain a positive sense of self by thinking about ourselves as being better at others, by seeking out situations where we can positively compare ourselves to others, right? And by taking credit for the things that we do well and trying to avoid credit for things that we do poorly, right? So these are all ways in which the self is buffered about on a day to day basis. Now, if you look in chapter 13, they're going to talk to you about classic approaches to studying personality development. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how the personality develops and why it develops. And on Tuesday, tomorrow, we're going to talk about measuring this thing called the personality. But there are three approaches to studying personality development that your book covers: the psychodynamic theory, humanistic theory, and social cognitive theory. I'm going to take a moment to respond to April. Societal beliefs, maybe. That's not a bad theory. Society does seem to judge men as being more valuable than women, doesn't it? Seems like it happens at work. Seems like it happens everywhere. Maybe I would agree. I would agree. That's not a bad theory, April. John, Yanan, does either of you have a theory? Now, what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about these approaches to personality. Okay? So, the first one, we're finally going to get to Sigmund Freud. Most people, when they think of psychology, they think of Sigmund Freud. He is the most famous of all psychologists, but not the most important. However, you can think of him as the first developmental psychologist because he was the first person to develop a theory of how people's personality develops. And he found an approach called the psychodynamic approach. He argued that people's personality was born out of conflict. Now, his theory was older than behaviorism. His theory was older than cognitive psychology. He actually developed his theory in the late 19th century, the 1890s. And he's the first rock star psychologist. And he developed his theory of personality within the context of understanding how personality problems develop. He was actually a clinical psychologist before clinical psychology existed. And he studied mostly female patients with neurosis, neurotic patients. All right. And he studied patients who had lots of anxiety problems about themselves. So his theory suggested that personality was a function of conflict. And if you look back here, the psychodynamic theory, the description, personality is based on unconscious wishes that create conflict. His theory was developed within the context of people who were suffering personality problems. So he developed a theory of personality that suggested your personality is a function of conflict. It was kind of a negative, pessimistic theory, if you will, and he developed while he was trying to figure out why these female patients were developing neurosis. And he argued that your personality comes from intrapsychic conflict between your needs and society's rules. April, you're talking about societal beliefs. What you mean, April, is the rules that govern men and female. And you're probably suggesting that these rules are more restrictive and constrictive for females. And you'd probably be right. Most of the time, there are more rules on what females can and can't do than there are on males. And even though we don't have rules today, think about just our general beliefs. When we think of doctors, we think of men, not women. When we think of construction workers, we think of men, not women. When we think of CEOs and business people, we think of men, not women. Now, this isn't to say that women can't be doctors or construction workers or business leaders, but historically, females have been less welcomed into these areas of society of society. And so if you think about it, there is conflict between what a female might want and what the world is prepared to give that female. So Freud thought that conflict was the most important part of personality. Now, Freud sort of hit upon this bizarro notion, maybe bizarre, maybe not bizarre, that the conflict really occurred between our instinctual needs for sex and society's rules. So if you've ever heard of Freud, you've always heard about him within the context of sex and crazy sex beliefs. And you know what? That's true. Freud thought that all human beings had an instinctual drive for sex and that society stymied these desires. Now, in a sense, this makes good sense because if human beings weren't driven by an instinctual need for sex, we wouldn't procreate, have children, and continue our species. So all species have an instinctual need for sex that is pretty strong. Now, he argued that in human society, on the one hand, uh, unlike other species, we have a ton of rules that govern how we engage in sex. And if you think about it, there are lots and lots of rules. You can go to the bathroom, you can wash your hands, you can do a lot of things, and nobody really cares. But sex, that is really controlled by these rules that society has. Now, you'll notice I have a star up here by sex. And if you look down at the bottom of the screen, you'll notice that there are a lot of other psychodynamic psychologists that thought different needs drove human personality development. And I will mention Human Maslow. We talked about him in theories of motivation. He incorporated lots of different motives in people's personality. And so lots of different psychologists had different theories about what the prime driving move for humans was. Freud thought it was sex, and he thought that personality occurred as we developed our strategies for fulfilling our sexual needs while not getting in trouble with society's rules. Now, according to him, we had three structures in our personality. The first, he argued, was instinctual. We were born with this thing called the id, and it's filled with this thing called libido. Anybody ever heard the term libido? Freud coined this term within the context of sexuality. I'm sorry, my nose is itching today. Whew. I don't know what that means. Somebody talking about me? And he argued that this libido was our reservoir of sexual energy. He argued that we were born with it. It was an instinctual desire. And he had this crazy theory, and I'm not going to go through the details of it, but he argued that even infants are born with libidinal desires. A life giving force is what he thought it was. And he argued that during the first 5 to 6 to 7 years, as we learn to manage this libidinal energy, we develop this thing called a superego, which is a control mechanism. And he argued that this control mechanism developed as a result of the shame and embarrassment of our first sexual attraction. Can anybody tell me which uh, which person do most human beings develop their first sexual attraction for? According to Freud. According to Freud. Does anybody know? People do have different expectations of man and women, Yanan. You are absolutely right. and the expectations of women are usually more limited. And that sort of fits in with this idea of instinctual needs and society's rules. Because, in a sense, if you think about it, we expect men to be more sexual than we do women. If a man acts sexually, it's okay. And we just say he's being manly. On the other hand, if a woman acts hypersexually, we have names, negative names and connotations for that women. So yes, there are rules like that. Yes, AK, April, the opposite sex parents. So according to Freud, around the age of 5 or 6, the male develops a sexual attraction for his mom, and the female develops a sexual attraction for her father. And what Freud argues is that this sexual attraction causes a great sense of guilt, which creates your superego. You can think of your superego as a conscience. You know the term we use, conscience, that control mechanism that keeps you from doing bad things? Freud called that your superego. Now, according to Freud, your id and your superego were both relatively subconscious. Oh, and you'll notice that if you look at this picture right below me, he envisioned personality as an iceberg, and most of your personality is underwater. Freud thought that most of what controls your motivations, what drives you, is unconscious. And he argued that your id, your desires, are completely below the level of awareness. And most of your conscience or your superego is also below your level of awareness. But he argues that you have conflict. I want to do this. You shouldn't do this. I want to do this. You shouldn't do this. And he argues that we develop this thing called an ego or a consciousness. And the job of the ego is to get what you want without getting in trouble. And so your personality, your conscious personality, is basically an attempt between these two competing parts of your personality to manage your day to day existence, to get what you want while not having you be humiliated and cast out by society. So he argues that this creates pressure, and conflict. Now, Freud argued that this conflict between our id and our superego creates psychological pressure. And he argued that we release this pressure in one of two ways. Now, the healthy way, he argued, is when we dream, because he argued when we go to sleep at night, our id doesn't know that we are asleep or awake. And so the id, if it's dreaming desires at night, it can't tell the difference between dreamed desires and lived desires. And so he argues when we go to sleep at night, our superego relaxes its vigilance and all of our desires come out, and we sort of live our desires in our dream world and release the pressure caused by these dreaming desires. How many of you have ever had a dream about killing somebody or stealing something or having a sexual encounter with someone whom you're not supposed to be sexually attracted to? How many of you have dreamed about things that you would be embarrassed to tell people about? According to Sigmund Freud, this is a normal process which allows you to release the tension that builds up in your mind during the evening, during the day. However, he argued some people build up so much pressure and have so much conflict, their desires are so strong, or their sense of shame is so strong that Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I hid my camera. I hid my camera. I hid my camera because I was scratching my nose. Excuse me. All right, let's go back. All right. So he argued. Did you folks hear when I was talking about dreaming? Did you hear when I was talking about dreaming? Okay. So according to Freud, we dream at night, and that's a healthy way of releasing the pressure that gets built up between the conflict of our id and our superego. So we build up this conflict during the day. And he argued at night we dream, and this allows us to release the pressure that builds up in our mind during the day. Okay, all right, all right. Now, he argued that dreaming is normal and good, and it releases this intrapsychic pressure. But he argues some of us have so much anxiety because of our desires or because of our sense of shame that we can't release enough energy at night to make ourselves feel better. So he argued that human beings engage in these defense mechanisms, which are strategies we use to manage the anxiety caused by the pressure from our id and our superego. Now, if you look in your book, you're going to notice there's a table which lists the most common defense mechanisms according to psychodynamic theory. Now, it turns out that Sigmund Freud had a daughter, Anna Freud. She wrote a book where she identified 50 different mechanisms we use to manage intrapsychic anxiety. But we're just going to focus on these top seven uh, mechanisms as identified by Freud. And I want you to be familiar with examples of these defense mechanisms. You'll notice that I have two of them circled, repression and sublimation. I have them circled because repression is the root cause of all of the root part of all of the negative defense mechanisms. And I have sublimation circled because, according to Freud, this was the only positive defense mechanism that we have. So, have any of you folks ever heard the term you're being repressed, or you've repressed that memory, or you've repressed that thought? Maybe you've heard the term repression. And there are, in fact, people who do repress memories, memories of being abused, memories of being sexually abused, memories of bad events. This is called motivated forgetting. And Freud was the first person to realize that people sometimes forgot traumatic events. And so, before you can engage in any other defense mechanism, you have to forget the original problem that you had. And so Freud argued that the most common defense mechanism was number one, was that you had to forget the original thing that was causing you anxiety. This is repression. He then argued after we repressed our original memory, we could then change it around to make it more palatable, right? Now, I remember my mom died at the age of 67 from emphysema. She smoked herself to death. My mom smoked probably 3 to 4 packs of cigarettes a day. And she just couldn't stop smoking. Now, when you talk to her about smoking, she would say, yeah, I quit smoking one time and all I did was cough. And so what she wouldn't admit was that the coughing was her lungs' way of trying to clear the gook out that had built up in her lungs. Instead, she said to me, smoking actually makes my lungs feel better. And it's quitting smoking that makes my lungs start to cough. My mom was denying the reality of her situation. So she was repressing the fact that she couldn't stop smoking. And then she was lying to herself about the harm that smoking was doing to her. She was denying the obvious. Some people, on the other hand, project their anxieties or their shame onto other people. How many of you, how many of you have ever had somebody, how many of you have ever had a romantic partner accuse you of being unfaithful or of cheating on them, and then come to find out they were the one cheating on you? This person is, in a sense, projecting their feelings onto you. How many of you have ever had someone who is incredibly angry but argues that you are an angry person? How many of you have ever had a person who is mean who tells you that you are mean? Those people, in a sense, are projecting their feelings, their unacceptable feelings, onto you. That's a defense mechanism. Now, yep, yep, okay, there you go. We got some people saying yes and agreeing with that. Now, have you ever heard people say that homophobic people are actually afraid of their own homosexual tendencies? If you've ever heard people say that, what they're arguing is that people who are homophobic are engaging in the defense mechanism of reaction formation. I don't have a story about homophobia, but I do have a story about my baseball coach from high school. I had a baseball coach in high school. I ran into him when I was in my 30s, and by the time he was in his late 50s, and he was a teacher at Cary High. Probably shouldn't have said that. But, and we struck up a friendship, and we would go out and have beers sometimes. And one of the things he would tell me is he would get so angry at you high school students. Oh my God, those high school students dress so scantily. They hardly wear any clothes. It just makes me so mad to see those girls running around in tight dresses and tight pants and tight shirts. I get so mad. And he would be so angry at these females dressing attractively. And you know what the thing was? He was actually very aroused by this, but he couldn't admit it because it made him feel guilty. So instead, he developed the exact opposite emotion. He became angry instead of being attracted. And so, what he was trying to do, he was trying to manage the guilt he felt by being attracted towards young female students. He was engaging in reaction formation, right? Now, sometimes people rationalize their feelings or their behaviors in order to sort of give an excuse for why they feel the way they do, right? So, if you failed out of school and you're really embarrassed about it, but you don't want to say it, you might say, yeah, I just didn't want to be a student. I thought that school was stupid. I didn't really enjoy that teacher. You know what? I've got better things to do. In a sense, what you're doing is you're rationalizing behavior because you can't admit that you didn't work hard or that you did something that's stupid that caused your situation. You were, in a sense, rationalizing your feelings. All right. And then the final negative defense mechanism is this idea of displacement. How many of you have been angry at a boss or a coworker and you can't say anything to them because you don't want to get fired, but you come home and you unload your feelings on a friend or a family member? Anybody ever done that before? If you have, you're engaging in displacement. How many of you have ever been attracted to somebody else, but you've come home and unload your sexual attraction on a romantic partner? In a sense, you may be displacing that inappropriate emotion from one target towards another target. And so, displacement is another way of managing anxiety. So, denial, repression, projection, reaction formation, rationalization, and displacement are all ways of managing feelings that we find to be unacceptable. According to Freud, all of these were problematic ways of managing anxiety. There was only one positive way of managing this anxiety, and Freud called this sublimation. So, you ever seen somebody that's incredibly motivated and studies really hard, or builds a business, or writes a book? According to Freud, most of our motivations come because we take our unrequited sexual desires and we channel them into positive activities. So, I'd really like to have sex, but I can't. So, I'm going to write a book. I'd really have this strong sexual impulse, and I can't demonstrate it, but I'll build a business. So, according to Freud, most of the cool things that have been built in society are a product of the sublimated sexual instinct. A little weird, don't you think? Now, Freud had a very negative view of the human personality. And according to Freud, the human personality was a negative thing built on conflict. I'd like to contrast him with a fellow named Carl Rogers, who didn't think that was the way. According to Freud, all personality is broke to a certain extent. According to Carl Rogers, in a sense, personality is a normal thing that grows up healthily unless something in society goes wrong. So he argued that just like an acorn grows into an oak tree unless it doesn't receive water, just like a tadpole grows into a frog unless it doesn't get any food, just like a human being will grow from a baby into an adult, we all have this actualizing tendency to develop into what our DNA says we should be. So all of us are going to grow up into adults unless we don't get enough food and water and love. And in those situations, we might not develop properly. But otherwise, we all have this tendency to grow into what our DNA says we should be. He argues that human beings have a self, and just like your arms and your legs and the rest of your body, your sense of self has an actualizing tendency. You are going to grow into a healthy person unless something prevents that. And so he argued that all human beings have what he called a self actualizing tendency, which is a tendency towards developing an authentic self. That is a real self that you feel good with. Now, according to Freud, your self is always this tenuous thing created by conflict between society and your desires. According to Rogers, that's not always the case. If people will let you be what you desire, then you will develop into a healthy, authentic self, whatever that is, be it heterosexual, be it homosexual, be it an artist, or be it a business person. You will develop into what you were meant to be. And he argues that this happens as long as people give you what's known as unconditional positive regard. That is, people accept you for who you are. If you have unconditional positive regard, that is, if people make you feel good about who you are, you will develop unconditional positive self regard, which is feeling good about yourself. However, what Carl Rogers argued was a lot of us grew up in a world where we are not accepted for who we are. Your parents have desires for you. Your parents probably wanted you to be a doctor or a lawyer or a military person or a scientist. How many of you had parents who conveyed to you what they wanted for you to be when you grew up? Did any of you feel that pressure? And we've got some people on the chat bar now. Uh, did any of you have a parent that told you what they wanted you to be? Did any of you have a parent that expressed disappointment in the things you did and the things you thought? How many of you were told that what you thought or what you believed or what you wanted wasn't quite right? Did any of you grow up in a world like that? I sure did. My dad wanted me to be a military guy. Then my dad wanted me to be an engineer. My dad really was never happy with my level of sports performance. I was always not quite good enough on an athletic field. Exactly, April. Your teacher didn't want you to be a teacher. Your mom, my dad, everybody's parent, instead of giving us unconditional positive regard, what they do is they give us conditional positive regard. They sort of suggested to us that we had to be certain things in order for them to really feel good about us. Exactly. They don't get paid well enough or respected. You know what? I would agree with that, April. We get a little bit of respect, but not nearly enough money, right? And so your parents probably engaged in gave you conditional positive regard. They said you have to do this in order for me to to give you kudos. And so, in a sense, you grew up believing that you had to be a certain thing in order to be loved. A lot of us grow up thinking that we have to be something in order to be lovable. I have to be wealthy. I have to be attractive. I have to be smart. I have to have this. In order for people to like me, I have to have this. You are living under what we would call conditions of positive regard. You have to do certain things in order for people to like you. And according to Carl Rogers, this is not normal. And these conditions of positive regard cause us to feel anxious about ourselves. And what he argued is that we begin to develop another self called the ideal self. And this ideal self may be completely different from who we actually are, our authentic self. Now, to a certain degree, there's always a little bit of difference between who the world wants us to be and who we really are. But usually, if we're okay, it's not that different. And so we have congruency between our actual self image and our ideal self image. And there's a lot of overlap, and we feel okay about ourselves. But according to Carl Rogers, the people that he met that had neurosis had a lot of incongruence between their authentic self and what people wanted them to be. And he argued it was this incongruence which was the root of most people's problems and caused neuroticism, depression, anxiety, and all of the problems that we usually wind up in the psychologist's office for. So, I would ask you, do you ever feel like you're disappointing someone with the way you're living your life? Are you experiencing conditional positive regard? We often talk about this with people who develop sexual identities which don't match what society wants. You're too sexual. You're not sexual enough. You are attracted to the wrong sex. You believe in your mind that your sexuality is one thing when society wants your sexuality to be another thing. And a lot of people have great anxiety and great problems because they are not able to live their authentic self identity. Instead, they have to show the world this ideal self and they have to pretend to be something that they really aren't. And this is sort of what Carl Rogers focused on. Now, the difference between Carl Rogers and Freud is Freud thought that conflict was always a part of personality. Carl Rogers thought that conflict was only a part of problematic personalities. All right, now, Albert Bandura asked the question, where does self-confidence come from? And he developed this thing called the social cognitive approach. And actually, the social cognitive approach is fundamental in clinical psychology today. And so what he argued is that people develop a sense of self from early experiences of reinforcement in life and punishment in life. So you press the lever and you're reinforced. You press the lever and you are punished. And after a while, we choose certain levers over others because those levers we believe will reinforce us. And we don't press other levers because we don't want to be punished. And so we ask the question, why would the rat choose one lever over another? You know, some people don't aspire to much and they don't try to do things. And you say, man, why don't you try going to school, John? Oh, if I went to school, I'd probably fail out because I'm not very smart. John hasn't even tried to get the degree, so he doesn't have any self efficacy. On the other hand, Mary's going to try everything because she thinks she could be successful. She's going to press every lever because she believes that she can become successful in any situation. Mary has high self efficacy. So, according to Albert Bandura's reciprocal deterministic model, what happens is over the early course of our life, some of us learn that pressing levers leads to positive life outcomes, and so we learn to press levers. On the other hand, some of us experience failure early in life, and this leads us not to try and press levers or to try new things. And so the feedback in our early environment creates self beliefs, And then these self beliefs change our behavior in the environment. So, sort of, I try things, and then the environment tells me what I can and can't try. And so he argues early in our life, we develop a set of expectations about whether or not we will be successful or fail. And he calls this personal belief self-efficacy. And he argues that human beings develops feelings of efficacy in very specific areas. Some of you may feel like great relationship partners, but bad students. Some of you may feel like great students, but bad relationship partners. Some of you think that you are great workers, but bad students. And so we have feelings of efficacy in lots of different specific areas. And this occurs because of early experiences with these different areas. And so Albert Bandura was interested in how we develop these feelings of efficacy. Now, he developed a theory and he argues what allows us to feel high self efficacy. He argued that there were four things: mastery experiences, vicarious success, social persuasion, and being able to manage our emotions. Now, the first is mastery experiences. People feel more confident when they are successful. So, if people put you in situations early on where you can be successful at a task, you will develop the feeling that you can be successful at that task. Sounds kind of obvious, but think about how often you're put into situations where your first experiences are failure, right? And when you fail early on, you may develop feelings that don't have mastery. And so you might say, wow, I can't do this. And that's because you failed early in your experience. Also, he argued, watching other people succeed. I don't know if you've ever tried to teach a child to swim or a child to dive in the pool, but a lot of times the child may be afraid to try that until they see the other children do that. And when they see the other children do that successfully, they say to themselves, hey, I can do it. Now, I'm a big rock and roll fan, and a lot of you probably won't know these social references. But Bob Dylan is considered the oldest and coolest rock star. But if you've ever listened to this guy sing, he is a horrible singer. His voice is very nasally and it's not very good. Jimi Hendrix, who came after Bob Dylan, was afraid to sing, but he listened to Bob Dylan sing and he said, wow, that guy is a terrible singer and he still is very, very famous. And so Bob Dylan's mastery experiences, his success, convinced Jimi Hendrix that he could try to sing as well. And Jimi Hendrix isn't a great singer, but he became very famous as a singer. And it's because he watched somebody else be successful. So, what helps us develop feelings of efficacy? Being successful and watching other people be successful at a task. Now, social persuasion also helps us. Having people tell us we can do it will help us develop feelings of efficacy. But you know what's more important than positive social persuasion? Negative social persuasion. One of the things that quickly tears down a person's self efficacy is being told that they are bad at something. And if you've ever had somebody, a parent, somebody you care about, somebody you respect, laugh at your ability or tell you that you are not good at something, you'll notice that it really, really, really affects your feelings of efficacy regarding that task. And finally, remember I told you a couple of weeks ago we were talking about emotions, and I said emotions are ways in which we can evaluate ourselves. They sort of give us knowledge about ourselves. Albert Bandura argued that we develop feelings of efficacy based upon our emotions. When we're hyper emotional and hyper aroused and our heart's beating really fast, we make the guess that it's because we're getting ready to fail at something. So he argues that having too much emotion and having fear is a guide to our mind that we're about to fail. And he argues this can impair our feelings of efficacy. On the other hand, if you're getting ready to take a test and you feel confident and you're not nervous, you interpret that as being as saying, you know what, I'm going to be good at this test. I can't tell you how many students tell me that they get really, really anxious when they sit down to take a test. this anxiety, this overload of emotion defeats their feelings of self-efficacy because people interpret it as, hey, I'm getting ready to fail at this test. Now, he argued that all of these things contribute to our feelings of efficacy or confidence about our ability to stop smoking, to do well in school, to do well at work, to meet people and be liked, to have romantic partners. And so, self efficacy is a fundamental part of who we are as human beings. It's our feelings of power. And he argued that early experiences in life can create people who are efficacious or people who are not efficacious. Now, his approach is foundational to current therapeutic process called cognitive behavioral therapy that we're going to talk about in 2 weeks when we get to chapter 15, psychological treatments. Okay, that's all I have to say for today. Does anyone have any questions about development of the self? Right? We talked about the self schema, which is your set of beliefs about who you are. I suggested to you that certain parts of yourself are chronically accessible. We'll call that your working self concept. And your working self concept may either be positive or negative. That's your self esteem, right? Most people are motivated to manage the self in such a way that we feel good about ourselves. So we engage in downward comparison if we can. We have positive illusions if we can. And then Sigmund Freud and Albert Bandura and Carl Rogers talked about how the self develops in context as we grow up. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye now. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me a text. Remember, this week's assignment for collaboration is to do the course evaluation that you can find in your student portal. There are instructions in your lesson folder, and try to get that to me by Thursday. Okay? Have a great day, and I will see you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.